Thank you for listening to the Chronicles of Christendom, a survey of medieval literature, by me, Mom Chilo. This podcast is dedicated to bringing light to medieval stories and viewing them from a traditional Christian perspective. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hey everyone, hope you're doing well today. So we're going over a Byzantine poem, a medieval Byzantine poem called Digenes Akritas. And from the Greek, this title would translate into something like the two-blooded borderer. So you have like the di as in like two, and then genes as in like genes, like genetics. So it's like the two genetic, and then you have the Akritas, which references, well, we'll get into it in a second, but essentially it means a sort of like border lord. Specifically, these people were on the eastern part of the Anatolian in the Byzantine or the Eastern Roman Empire, and one of their main roles was to protect the empire from raids from their neighbors directly to the east of them, specifically their Muslim neighbors. But we'll get more into that later. But for now, I want to talk about the version I'm using. So I'm using a sort of older translation by John Mavrogordato from 1953. There's more recent versions you can find, but this is the one I'm using because it's the one I had available. And there's many different manuscripts of this story. So the translation that we're using primarily gets the text source from the Grotta Ferrata monastery. So this is a Greek monastery in Italy that has a copy of this manuscript, and I think generally speaking it's considered the most like complete or intact manuscript. But there's a few parts where this translation also uses some of the other manuscripts to fill in some of the details and missing parts of the text. And I do want to get a little into the manuscript history, but not too much. So many of the manuscripts, in fact, I think most of the manuscripts that we have of this story actually derive from monasteries. There's even a manuscript that we found all the way out in Spain, of all places, of this Greek story. Another version that we have was given to a Greek school teacher by some monk. And then we also have, interestingly, we have some Slavonic partial manuscripts of the story as well. And I want to point out that when I say Greek, it's interesting that these manuscripts are in Demotic Greek instead of the more, literary Greek of Attic Greek. So it kind of shows that the story was meant for a more popular audience. But we'll get a little more into that later. So the bulk of these manuscripts can be dated from the 1300s all the way to about the 1700s. However, it's clear that the story is actually much older. It was probably originally written during the Komneni Restoration period, and this period refers to the Komneni dynasty in Byzantium, which were a series of kings and rulers who really helped the empire get back from some major setbacks, specifically the loss of a lot of Anatolian land. So this is like modern day Turkey, if you weren't familiar. And one of their main projects they undertook was retaking Anatolia that they had earlier lost. But the story itself seems to take place during the 900s, when there was an eastward expansion of the empire beyond Anatolia, up until parts of the eastern Mediterranean and all the way to the Euphrates River. So in that sense, you can kind of view this as a sort of like propaganda in a sense, right? So that's why a lot of people view this story as a piece of like imperial propaganda, because it's about an old conquest in the midst of new conquest going about. So it's kind of connecting these two conquests together. And from my research for this podcast, what I found is that there's really not much about this story in English. There is a lot or a little bit about like the manuscript history and some of the background, but mainly what people, when they're viewing this story, have done, at least in the English-speaking world, is they have used it to as a mine for historical data, trying to find little details in the story and relating that to Byzantine history and kind of trying to connect some dots and things like that. In which, while that might be interesting, that's really not what we're trying to do here. Rather, I want to talk about the story itself, which frankly, I haven't seen much done of that in the English-speaking world. So before we jump into the story, though, I want to give a little bit more background. So as I said, the story takes place in the 900s when the Byzantine Empire is pushing eastwards. and it takes place on the eastern edge of the empire. So this was a rather tumultuous region. It was, subject to Arab raids from their neighbors, and in this region, you had what were called the Akrites, who were these warriors on the frontier whose job was to protect from Arab incursions, as well as their job was to also launch their own incursions into Arab lands as well. And a lot of these incursions weren't full-scale wars per se. Rather, what a lot of it were these border skirmishes and raids into each other's lands, and not necessarily, full-on, thousands of men going into a place and trying to, hold down cities. And it's from Akrites that we get the word Akritas, which is the title of the hero. And this isn't the only Akritic story that we have. We have plenty of other stories as well, both written as well as there's a big oral tradition as well about some of these warriors. We don't really know what the exact relationship is between the oral and the written. I would probably imagine it kind of goes both ways. But the fact that there's all these oral traditions indicates that these are rather popular folk stories, not necessarily just from a more literary elite from Constantinople who are writing these stories. But by far the most famous hero in these cycles is, Digenes Akritas, the two-blooded borderer, and that's the one we're talking about today. I guess in a sense you can kind of view the Akrites as kind of like Cossacks in a way. These kind of rough and tumble people on the frontier who sort of defend the frontier as well as launch incursions against their own neighbors, but also become their own sort of nobility or aristocracy as well, but away from the center of imperial power. So at the very start of this poem, we get a brief overview of who Digenes Akritas is, and his birth name, by the way, is Basil. And I'll read here at the start of the poem. So it says, "Honors, triumphs, and the praise of the thrice-blessed borderer Basil, the very noble, most brave, who had his strength as gift from God, and overthrew all Syria, Babylon, all Hyrcania, Armenia, Cappadocia, Amorion, and Iconium, and that famous and great fortress, the mighty and the fortified Ancyra, and all of Smyrna, and the seaside subduing. I will declare his works to you, which in the present life he did, how warriors mighty and brave he overawed, and all the wild beast, having to help the grace of God, and of God's mother unconquerable, of the angels and archangels, of the prize-bearing great martyrs, of both the glorious Theodores, the host leader, and the recruit, of noble George of many trials, and wonder-working martyr of martyrs, glorious Demetrios, defender of Basil, boast and pride of him, who had victory over his adversaries, the Hagarenes and Ishmaelites, and barbarous Scyths, who raged like dogs." So here it describes a lot of the enemies of Byzantium, as well as it invokes all these warrior saints. Like it says both the Theodore, so Theodore the general, Theodore the recruits. It implies the Archangel Michael, as well as, you have Saint Demetrios as well, who is also a warrior saint. But we don't really learn anything more about Basil for quite some time. The story goes into what's normally called the Lay of the Emir. And the Emir is an Arab lord, next to, I think he's in Syria sort of. So he's next to the Byzantine Empire. However, he's on the other side. He's on the western border of the Muslim empires. And then the poem talks about the Emir's, how he launched raids into eastern Anatolia, and specifically how in one raid, he captures a certain general's daughter and brings her back into his lands, specifically into his own household. We then hear the lament of the girl's mother, and she says to her 5 sons, she says to them, "Hasten to free your sister and your mother, her from captivity and me from death. We would give all existence for her sake. Prefer not life to your sister's account. Have mercy, children mine, on your own sister. Go out in haste to her deliverance, else you shall see me dead, mother for child, and shall receive your father's curse and mine, if this you do not as I have proposed." So, of course, the 5 brothers head out to the other side of the border, and they go to the Emir, who has captured the daughter, and they go up to him. They're very flattering, not trying to cause any scene or anything, and then they say that they want their sister back. And then it says that the Emir responds, and this is an interesting note. It says he responds in the Roman tongue, so he was speaking Greek, presumably. And this detail reveals a lot, especially when you when you realize that the Greek word for barbarian has to do with the language of the non-Greeks. It means like it's kind of like an onomatopoeia where they're saying bar. It's kind of like making fun of how non-Greek speakers speak. So the fact that this emir, this Arab Muslim guy, is speaking Greek shows that he is not necessarily a barbarian. And in some sense, he might be. He's not a Christian, etc. However, he is educated. So in some sense, he's like a step above your normal, Arab Muslim. So he's speaking to them in Greek, and he says that he will return her if they choose one of the brothers to fight him and they win. And if they win, he'll give her back. And if they don't win, then he's going to take all of them as his slaves. And knowing their parents' lament and, their own lament as well for their sister, so they cast lots to decide who's going to, fight the emir. So casting lots, that's, in modern times, we might say, drawing straws. They kind of, pick at random who's going to fight him. And then the lot goes on to the youngest brother, Constantine, who also happens to be that sister's twin. And then the poem adds the detail that before the brother goes out to fight, all the brothers pray facing east. And what's noticeable about this detail is that in Islam, they don't necessarily pray facing east. They pray facing Mecca. So in this case, Muslims in this area would be praying facing south towards Mecca. Whereas in Christianity, or at least in Orthodox Christianity, both then and even now in Orthodox Christianity, people pray, at least in a liturgical sense, they pray facing always towards the east, no matter where they are. So in some sense, there's a little bit of an anti-Islamic apologetics going on. And we'll see quite a bit of that throughout this poem, this kind of like anti-Islamic sentiment and this kind of pro-Christian apologetic that happens. So the youngest brother goes out to fight the emir, and they fight for several hours. But after a few hours, it's pretty clear that the brother is going to win, and then the emir's men tell the emir that he needs to surrender now, lest he be severely hurt or even die. So the emir surrenders. And then the emir gives the brothers his signet and tells them that he can search all the camps to try and find the girl. And the signet ring, that's essentially like the king's authority or the king's power. So since they have the ring from the emir, anybody who questions them, they can just sort of show the ring, and that will give them the authority to kind of do whatever they want. But they search all the camps and they don't find the girl. And then there's a Saracen peasant who comes to them and says that maybe they should try looking in this cliff, or this like underneath a cliff, or like this ravine where the Muslims had slaughtered a bunch of Christians earlier, and he suggests that she might be there. So then they go and look there, and they just find a bunch of dismembered bodies. They don't really see anything that could necessarily be the girl. They think maybe she's here, but the bodies are just so disfigured that there's no way to tell. So then they go and tell the emir that they can't find her. And the emir, he asked an interesting question. He basically asked them about their lineage before he tells them anything else. And then I'm going to read about their family here. So they respond to the emir saying, "We from the eastern theme of noble Romans." So a theme is sort of like a province in a sense. And then they say, "Our father is descended from the Kinemades, our mother Aducas of Constantine's family." So this is like Constantine the Great. 12 generals, our cousins and our uncles, of such descended we all with our own sister. Our father banished for some foolishness, which certain slanderers contrived from him. And none of us was there at your attack, for that we were commanding on the border. So this was kind of the job of the Akrites, defending the border, as I kind of talked about earlier. And then they continue, they say, "For if we had been there, this had not been. Into our home you had not ever come. But since we were not, you may boast it well. O greatest of emirs and chief of Syria, to Baghdad may you bow. Say who you are, and if our kinsmen come from their campaign and bring our father back from banishment, know we will seek you out wherever you be, and never leave you daring unavenged." So essentially they're threatening the emir to say, give us our sister back, or we're going to come back when our father comes back, and we're going to deal with you ourselves. And then the emir responds with his own lineage. I won't go into it, or at least I won't quote it verbatim here. However, the main thing that I found interesting or unique here is that we learned that the emir was adopted by Arabs who brought him up in Islam, and that his actual father was the leader of the Paulicians. So I could talk a lot about the Paulicians. However, the main thing to note about them is that they're a heretical Christian group. They're not a heresy from like Constantinopolitan Christianity, like Orthodox Christianity. Rather, they're heretics and schismatics from the Armenian Church, which at this time was different from the faith of Constantinople, because the Armenians did not accept the Fourth Ecumenical Council, the Council of Chalcedon. And the Paulicians, they're likened to the Manichees, if you're familiar with who those people are. So they're kind of like, I hate to use this word, but they're like a quote-unquote Gnostic sect of Christianity. They have a lot of really weird beliefs about like the evil of the material realm and how you need to be spiritual, sort of things like that. And they eventually kind of became their own political power, and they had their own sort of like kingdom in a sense, and they had militaries and things like that. And they were attacking, or they were attacked by both the Arabs and the Byzantine Empire. And eventually the Byzantines take them and they deport them out west to like Thrace, over where Bulgaria today is. And they eventually influenced a group that would come up later called the Bogomils, which was another sort of like a Gnostic sort of Christian group. And then after the emir kind of goes on about his conquest and his greatness as an emir or as a lord, he says, "A woman, though, has conquered me most lovely," referring to their sister, "whose beauties burn me and whose tears consume. Her sighs inflame. I know not what to do. For her sake, but to know for sure I tried you. She never ceases, ever weeps for you. Now wholly I confess and speak the truth. If you deign have me as your sister's husband, for the sweet beauty of your own dear sister, I will become a Christian in Romania, and listen to the truth by the great prophet. She never kissed me, never spoke to me." So the emir was basically testing them, making sure they really did love their sister. And since they passed his test, he admits to them that he's actually holding her in his own sort of private household, and that he actually wants to marry her. And he kind of says, "Look, I never touched her, I never kissed her, I didn't do anything like that, and I'm willing to marry her and go all the way to Romania, or like the Byzantine Empire, and become a Christian myself." So after the brothers hear him out, they agree. And then they get their sister and the emir, and they all go back to the Byzantine Empire. And then the emir also frees a lot of his captives as well. And then the emir does actually become a baptized Christian, and then he marries the sister. And then they have a child, Basil, or Digenes Akritas. And his conversion is very sincere. We'll see that throughout the story, but he's not just doing this opportunistically. He was truly moved by her beauty and becomes a devout Christian, leaving his empire, leaving his, kinsmen behind as well, including his mother. And so then that's sort of the next part of the story, where after the emir has been living with this girl, he eventually gets a letter from his mother. And the letter is very scornful. It's basically the mother saying, "How dare you leave your kinsmen and all of us behind, yada, yada, yada. You need to come back and visit me," all the things you would expect from a letter like that. So then the emir starts heading back to visit his mother, and he takes his wife and the child along with them. However, one of the brothers has a dream. It's a very allegorical dream, but they interpret it as the emir leaving back to Syria. So they take their men and they intercept the emir who's leaving, because the emir didn't tell them. And then there's this sort of huge confusion that comes about. They think that he's kind of going back to his old ways and taking his wife and the child with them. There's a very intense kind of confrontation. But then eventually they realize that the emir has good intentions and that he's only going to visit and he's not actually leaving. However, they make sure that he doesn't bring the wife or the child with him. And, he's fine with that. And so then he goes off to visit his mother. So the question that I had over this episode is, why is this part included in the story? Why do we learn about this? The, intercepting and then, realizing everything's okay and then kind of going on almost business as usual. And I think it's an excuse for the poem to talk about like the passions and love. So the poem says that love being dishonored brings on chiding. And then later it adds that the excess of sorrow madness breeds, and many therefrom venture what is lawless. So it's like the idea that you have to watch out over the passions. And we see this a lot in some of the details in the poem, which are often glossed over in summaries, because the poem has a lot to say about the passions, about love, and how too much love can bring about, a certain amount of excess. And we're going to see some excess with Digenes here in a minute. But the other reason I think this part might be added is because it's trying to show that the emir has, he's kind of pure of heart. He has good intentions, and that he's not just converting for, opportunistic reasons. And I think this is backed up by the next part of the poem, which says, "Thus, every lover is the slave of love, for he is as a judge tormenting hearts, of who keep not rightly the roads of love. Straightly he aims his bolts and shoots at hearts, and stands with fire to inflame consideration. Whoever has him can no more escape, one of the famous even or very rich, for he uprising quickly catches him. Thus happening that wonderful emir, despising fame and great authority, forgot his kin, his parents, and his country, even denied his faith for a girl's love, one indeed truly fair and very noble. The one-time foe was seen the slave of love. For his beloved he dwelled in Romania. From Syria had a letter from his mother, resolved to go away fearing her curse, for it is righteous not to anger parents. A council being made, and vows between them, all sent him forth with gladness on his way." So here the poem just kind of cements again this idea that the emir, is of good heart, is doing these things for the right reason. So he finally reaches his mother, and as you can imagine, as the letter kind of implied, his mother's a bit upset. She says to him, "O sweetest child of mine, light of my eyes, and consolation of my soul and age, pleasant delight and gladness of my heart, say why you have tarried, child, in Romania. Not seeing you, I would not see light at all, nor sun shining, nor in the world to live. Do strange wonders happen in Romania, such as are done, child, at the prophet's tomb," so like the prophet Muhammad's tomb. "Where you went with me going to my prayers, saw you a wonder strange, how in the night, without a light, came radiance from on high, filled the whole house with light unspeakable? Did you see bears and lions, wolves with sheep, and many kinds of beasts together feeding?" So this is like a reference to Isaiah. And then she says, "Not hurting one another, not at all, but all there waiting till the final prayer? Then how bending the knee they straight retired? Did you see greater wonder in Romania? Is there not with us Naaman's kerchief, who was a king among the Assyrians, though worthy of wonders for his host of virtues? How did you come, child, to transgress all this, and power did despise and greatest fame? They all believed that you would conquer Egypt, but you turned obstacle of your own fortune, and gave up everything for a Roman girl." So in his mother's lambasting here, we see a couple of things. So one is that she cites all of these kind of relics and miracles, and many of them are actually Christian ones, right? So when she references Naaman's kerchief, that's a story back to the Book of Kings with Elisha, and she even cites some of the imagery used in Isaiah. And this shows how Islam, views some of the Old Testament. They accept parts of it, at least here, that we see. Although if you kind of push them on this today, they'll say that there's certain Christian corruptions that occurred in the Old Testament. But that's neither here nor there right now. But then the emir responds to his mother by engaging in a bit of a Christian apologetic. So he cites how even the Muslims worship the tomb of Jesus. And then he also starts, just generally speaking, to kind of proclaim, the gospel, proclaim, how you can achieve eternal life through Jesus and all these things. And he also essentially cites the creed to his mother as well. And I'll read the last part of his speech. So he says, "Mother, if you wish to be thought worthy of life, from fire redeemed in the eternal darkness, fly from vain error and invented tales, and recognize the God in three persons, united in one substance unconfounded. Listen to your own Son and come with me. I will be your Father in the Holy Spirit, and when baptized, your sponsor in rebirth." And so his mother accepts this, and then they go back to Romania, along with more of their kinsmen and more of their household. And when they go back, they all get baptized and all become Christians. And then the poem has some commentary about this. It says, "Strange wonder truly, work of upright love. Who would not be amazed? Who would not wonder, and here learn of the exact powers of love, how he joined foreign races in one faith?" And now finally, the story shifts to the emir's son, Basil, or Digenes Akritas, the namesake of this poem. And then we have the young Basil saying to his father, "Desire is in my soul, master and father, to try myself in fighting with wild beasts. And if you love at all your son Basil, let us go out to a place where there are beasts, and you shall see the purpose that still irks me." But his father is very hesitant to let him go out. He says he is too young. He's only 12 years old at this point. However, after some more insisting, his father finally allows him to go out hunting with him. And it's here we see Basil kill a bear, with just his hands, with his bare hands, no pun intended. And then we see him rip a deer in half, also with just his hands. And then we see a lion jump on them to attack them in a sort of surprise attack, and then Basil is able to slice its head off. So we see from a very early age how strong Basil is. And then when Basil is a bit older, we see him interact or run into the Apolati. So the Apolati, or in some translations like the one I'm using, it calls them reavers. These Apolati, they were kind of like the Akrites in the sense that their job was sort of border defense, but they didn't really have that noble or aristocratic air to them. Rather, what they were sort of like gangs first, these sort of roving, marauding gangs, like highway robbers. But they would also be employed sometimes by the Empire to, engage in border defense. And the gang that he meets here, it's a rather notorious gang, and Basil says that he wants to join them. So they have dinner with him, and then they kind of challenge him to some sparring, like sparring with sticks. And then Basil is able to beat all of them while they're all attacking him at the same time. And he doesn't actually end up joining them. The episode just kind of ends off. It doesn't really say why he never joined them or if he ever did really. But what the poem is doing here is creating a sort of contrast between the Akrites, who have a more noble air about them, versus the more sort of rough around the edges, to say it euphemistically, of the Apolati. And then once Basil gets of marriageable age, we see him with his father riding about, and they come across the dwelling of one of their distant relatives who have a daughter named Evdokia. And it's notable here that this girl, Evdokia, she's the daughter of a famous general, much like how the emir's wife, or Basil's mother, was also the daughter of a famous general. And we're going to see a lot of comparisons between these two families here in a second, or at least in their love stories. So while he's riding with his father, he learns that many people have tried to capture this girl, presumably in order to marry her, but the general, her father, has always beat them back. And we also learn that the general has refused all offers of marriage to the girl. So that's probably why people were trying to capture the girl, because the general didn't allow anyone to marry his daughter. But when Basil sees this girl through her window, he instantly falls in love and becomes just enamored by her. Passion was urging to some wanton deed, the poem says, for passion, as being master, enslaves the mind, as charioteer the horse subdues the reason. Wherefore the lover has no discipline, no shame of kindred, no respect for neighbors, but is all shameless, being slave of love. And this analogy is rather Platonic. Plato uses a very similar analogy in describing the soul as a sort of charioteer, where there's two horses. There's like a white horse and a black horse. And one horse represents the sort of moral, more rational side of man, and the other horse represents like the passions or the irrational side of man. And it's the job of the soul as this charioteer to balance both horses. But we see in this analogy of what the poem is ascribing to Basil is that he's giving too much to one of the horses, too much the irrational and passionate side because of his love for this girl. So Basil ends up speaking with Evdokia, and he tells her that he will return tomorrow and that she should be ready for him. And Basil's love of this girl is so deep, so strong, that when he goes back home to try to eat dinner, he's not even able to get himself to eat because his mind is so preoccupied with this girl. And then as the night falls, he takes his lute and his horse and he goes back to where the girl is staying. And then the girl at this point has just given up the fact that he will ever come back because it is quite late. But then he comes up to her window and he starts playing his lute and he sings this song saying, "How have you, dear, forgotten our young love? Fallen sweet asleep, carelessly, easily? Rise up, my love rose, my scented apple. The morning star is risen. Let us go." And then Evdokia warns him, that the general, her father, is going to try to stop them if they try to leave. But he says, if you knew who I was, you wouldn't even be worried about any of that. So Basil is quite sure of his abilities here. He then gets very poetic and tells the girl how much he loves her. And then they make these vows of love to each other before they leave on horseback. And then as Basil is taking this girl back, in a sense, sort of like kidnapping her, he says, while they're leaving, he shouts out to the household. He says, "Bless me, Lord Father-in-law, with your daughter, and then thank God for such a son-in-law." Part of the reason why Basil does this, shouts out that he's essentially kidnapping the girl, is so that it's technically not a kidnapping. And this has to do with the way that ecclesiastical and civil law at the time worked. So by exclaiming to the household that he's taking the girl, it's not really a kidnapping in a sense. It's kind of weird how he has to sort of balance these cultural norms, but that seems to be what's going on. But I don't really want to get too into that. But the main thing is that when he shouts this out to the family, to the household, it awakens the sentries and all the household. And then they go out to chase Basil along with Evdokia. And so there's a parallel here. So if you remember what happened with Basil's family, with his mom and his dad, his mom, who was also the daughter of a general, was also captured by a sort of border lord. But in this case, it was an Arab or Syrian border lord. And then there's another parallel where once the girl is kidnapped, the family goes after them. And then, like how in the story of his mom and dad, they also end up getting married. So, spoilers. So, while they're being chased, Basil turns around and he ends up fighting the people who are chasing him. He fights the soldiers of the family, but he doesn't actually fight the family itself. He doesn't fight or harm the brothers. It's made very explicit that he just kind of disarms them, but he doesn't cause any harm to them. And then the general is actually very impressed by this. And he eventually, like Basil suggested, he ends up thanking God that he has such a strong son-in-law. So I think this kind of gives you a flavor of what life was like on the frontier at this time, where a general doesn't allow his daughter to get married. And in a sense, he's almost challenging people to kidnap his daughter and then beat off the challengers so that the daughter can have a husband who's strong enough to sort of withstand the conditions of what life is like in this border region. So after they stop fighting, the general says that he wants to give Basil a dowry for the girl, and he wants to negotiate a marriage contract. But Basil refuses this offer, and he says that her beauty is enough of a dowry for him. So Basil ends up taking the girl back to his family, and they end up getting married, and they have a 3-month-long wedding celebration. And then Basil and Evdokia go back to her family, and then they have another large wedding celebration. And then we're told that there actually was a dowry given, and the text doesn't say this explicitly, but it seems to be implicit in the text at least, that it wasn't so much Basil who arranged this, rather it was the family who wanted to make sure things were done sort of in the normal order, I guess you could say, with regards to the wedding. And then once they get done celebrating with Evdokia's family, they then live on their own. And when I say on their own, I mean away from both of their families. However, they still have servants and soldiers who are with them at their household. So while Basil and Evdokia are living alone, they get a letter from the emperor. So the emperor at this point, he's out fighting in the east against the Persians, and he summons Basil to come to the Euphrates River to talk to him. So Basil goes out and he talks to the emperor, and it says that they embrace each other and they praise each other. And the emperor says that he can request anything, that Basil can request anything. But Basil here has an interesting response. He tells the emperor, he says, "Master, keep everything. Your love alone is quite enough for me. It is not right to be taking but rather giving. You have unmatched expenses in your army. I claim and I entreat your glorious power to love obedience, pity the poor, deliver from injustice the oppressed, accord forgiveness to unwilling faults, not to heed slanders, accept no injustice, scatter the heretics, confirm the orthodox. These, master, are the arms of righteousness, with which you can overcome all your enemies. For rule and kingship belong not to might. Only God grants it, and the highest right hand. I, worthless as I am, grant to your power the tribute once it paid Iconium, as much again from their unwilling hands. From this care, master, I will set you free until my soul goes from its tabernacle. So, in a sense, Basil is kind of talking down to the emperor, and it's interesting that the way that the poem describes Basil in this, it says that the boy replied, and then it gives that speech that I just gave you. So, even though this quote-unquote boy is just a boy and not the emperor, he's talking to the emperor as if he's his superior. He's giving him commands. He's saying, love obedience and treat the poor, do all these things, do justice, don't do injustice. He's telling the king, the emperor, to do all these things. But the king doesn't get mad at this. Rather, he's actually quite impressed. He responds to him saying, "O wondrous, excellent young man, my majesty appoints you a patrician, granting you all your grandfather's estates. I assign you authority to rule the borders. These things I will fast confirm in a golden bull, and precious royal vestments I bestow." So after Basil essentially, spoke down to the king, the emperor then makes him a lord, and he gives him his grandfather's estate, and all of his lands. So if you remember from the very beginning, when it talked about Basil's mother, it says that she was the daughter of a disgraced general. But now, through Basil, that general in a sense is becoming undisgraced, and Basil is getting his titles and his lands. So here officially, Basil becomes Digenes Akritas, the two-blooded border lord. Not just, one of the Akriti, but in a sense he becomes the Akriti, or the Akritas rather. But now we come to a more unsavory episode in Digenes Akritas' life. So the poem reads, "All youthfulness is vanity indeed, when reaching out after unruly pleasures. But he who firmly manage its reins," so here going back to that Platonic imagery we talked about earlier with the chariot, so it says, "He who firmly manages its reins ever remains unconquered by the passions, and is made heir of the eternal life. Instead of brief pleasure, base and unclean, who waxes wanton cannot win the eternal, as fire can never be without oil extinguished. Neither can the wanton ever escape sin, by which the fire is fed from all the unchaste." And then we come to Basil, who meets another person, and then it says that he tells him this story for the sake of confessing his sins. So the story goes that Basil was wandering in the swamps and the marshlands, and he encounters this girl, and he talks with the girl, and he realizes that this girl, this girl was crying earlier, by the way, he realizes that this crying girl, after speaking with her, is a sort of runaway from the Arab lands. She had ran away with one of her family's Roman slaves, and this Roman slave, this Roman captive, is said to be the son of a famous general. So again, we have more parallels with Basil's family and now with his own, wife, but this time the roles are a bit reversed, where it's the girl who comes from the Arab family who's the daughter of an emir, and then it's the man rather than the woman who is the child of a famous general. However, he realizes why the girl's crying, and she's crying because the Roman that she ran away with actually kind of left her for dead in the middle of the night. He took all of their household goods that they brought with them and the horse they came with, and then he kind of ran off in the middle of the night, leaving the girl there. And then after some more talking, Basil realizes that earlier he had saved a certain Roman from these Arab raiders, and he realizes that the Roman that he had saved was the lover of this girl who had ran off. And then once he relays this to her and they kind of figure it all out, the girl then offers herself, sexually to Basil. And then Basil tries to resist, but it says that the passions overtook him, and then they, did the deed. And then afterwards, after they get done with their business there, he goes out to find the lover that he had earlier saved, and then he forces her to marry this girl. And I think it should also be pointed out that this girl had already been baptized and accepted Christianity in order to marry this boy who ran away from her, but now is compelled to marry her. And it seems like to me in my reading of the story that the reason why Basil compels the boy to marry the girl is so that, in case that they had a child, he could plausibly not be blamed for it. So this reminds me of the story with David, where after he sleeps with one of his general's wives, he then summons that general back from the front lines and then tries to get the general to go and, sleep with his wife so that in case that there was a child who was conceived in David's lust, that, it wouldn't be known that it was David, or at least he could have some plausible deniability. It doesn't really seem to have been done for the most altruistic reasons, shall we say. And then when Basil comes back home to his wife, she kind of senses that he was being unfaithful to her, and then they decide to move locations. It's not really explained why they decided to move. Maybe it's this idea that, they needed a change of scenery, so to speak. But anyways, after this story, or that little episode, we then go into the next part of the story where Evdokia and Basil are hanging outside, and Basil is outside asleep while Evdokia is, at a spring kind of, in the water. And then while she's in the water, a serpent appears to her, but it's not just a serpent in the form of a serpent. Rather, it's a serpent in the form of a very attractive young man specifically, who tries to seduce Evdokia. But she's aware of this, and then she cries out to her husband. So Basil wakes up from his little nap that he's taken outside, and then he goes to fight the serpent. But when he goes to this handsome youth, it turns into the serpent with these 3 heads that all breathe fire. And, Basil being, Digenes Akritas, he's able to cut off all the heads of the serpents. So then he goes back to sleep, and then Evdokia continues to, kind of play in the spring. But then a lion comes after her, and then she again calls for her husband, and then Basil goes and deals with the lion. So we've had all these things come after Evdokia, but now there's another threat. So it's the Apolati who we met, towards the beginning of the story that Digenes had interacted with and tried to join earlier. So Digenes is out with his wife, and he's now playing the lute. And while the Apolati are out, I guess, roaming around, milling about, as it were, they hear this lute, and then they go and see where it's coming from, and they see Evdokia along with Basil. And the leader of the Apolati, he starts to covet the girl. He wants to have the girl for himself. So he takes his men, and then he goes and tries to attack them. However, after a quite extended battle, Basil eventually beats them back. But they're not done yet. So while they lick their wounds, they contact one of their kinsmen, an Amazon woman. So the Amazons in Greek mythology and Greek stories are these women who fight, these warrior women. Specifically, the one they call upon is one of their kinsmen, or at least the leader's kinsman, and her name is Maximo. So after he talks with her, he sends her out to fight against Basil, and he lets her take 100 of his soldiers to go along with him. And Maximo is a bit off-put by this, by the fact that the Apolati want her to bring 100 soldiers with them to the battle. She eventually does agree, and then they go out and fight against Basil, but she seems to intentionally give up, and then she kind of leaves the rest of the soldiers for dead. But then when Basil comes back to the disarmed now Maximo, she tells him that she wants to have a rematch, a one-on-one, which is, I guess, is the more honorable way that she wants to fight. And then they both agree that they'll fight one-on-one on the next day. So the next day comes, and they have their fight, and eventually, Basil being Basil, he beats her. But then while she's surrendering, she offers herself to Digenes, and although he tries to suppress his lust again, he's unable to, and then they do the deed. And then when he returns home, his wife is very suspicious. He's like, why did it take so long? And Digenes says, oh, I was busy bandaging up her wounds after I beat her. But she's very suspicious, and she doesn't outright accuse her husband of being unfaithful. However, she kind of implies it when she says that, God is the ultimate judge, and God will judge him if he did anything wrong. And then Basil gets really angry at this, and then he goes back to where Maximo is, and then he just kills her. So while temporally the story is quite distant from the other act of lust that Basil engaged in with that runaway girl, the story nonetheless is comparing these two episodes together. So I think what's happening is that after Basil's initial lust or episode of lust, we then see his wife have to endure all this hardship. There's like the snake, the lion, and the Apolati who come after her. And I think that's sort of like this idea that when you sin, these other horrible things enter into the world because of your sin, or these other horrible circumstances can come about because of that, and now you have to deal with them. And it doesn't just have to be you in particular who does the sin, right? So Evdokia, she's faithful. We're not told of any times that she sins in the story, yet nonetheless, she has to, deal with some of the issues that were caused due to her husband's sin. And then we see, though, with these new challenges that arise that Basil has to deal with as a sort of artifact or as a result of his sin, he then engages in more sin with the lust against Maximo, as well as when he goes and then he just kills her in cold blood after they had, already finished their battle. So although Basil is this, Anatolian folk hero, and then later he becomes, generally speaking, a sort of Greek hero of folklore, he still has his faults, he still has his flaws. And I think that this in part is due to what we might call the monstrous nature of Basil, right? So he's called Digenes, which means the two-blooded one, or that the twi-born, or something like that. So even in his chronology, or in his genealogy rather, when it's talking about his family and his parents, it says that he's the son of a Christian mother, but then it says he's also the son of a pagan father. So even though his father had converted to Christianity, and it was a sincere conversion to Christianity, nonetheless in the genealogy, it says that he's the product of a pagan and a Christian. So I think the reason why the poem is doing this is it wants to emphasize this sort of, liminal nature of Digenes, the way that he is the product of two different lines coming together in one. But because of that, you do get some weird things going on with that. So if you remember earlier, after he gets married to Evdokia, the poem makes a note about how they decide to live alone. And I think that's because Basil doesn't fit squarely into any one category. So in a sense, he sort of has to live alone and on the edge. And then eventually he makes his home on the Euphrates River, which at this time was the boundary marker between the Roman Empire and then the Muslim lands out east. But there are some upsides with being a monster in some sense, right? For instance, he gets this superhuman strength that comes to him. And for the most part, he's able to use it for good. He's able to, beat back these brigands. He's able to, help his wife when she's, about to be captured or eaten. And then later on in the epilogue, we're told about all of his military might and his military conquest against the enemies of the Byzantine Empire. So he is able to use this strength for good. However, what comes with this strength, it seems like, is this these passions that he has. And it seems to imply that he has them more than other people do, or he's not able to control them as well as other people can because he is this sort of monster. And because of that, he has to live on the edge. And living on the edge, living on the border in this liminal space, although he doesn't have a role elsewhere in society, in a sense, he is able to put his, superhuman strength to good use, being on the edge and helping defend the empire against its enemies. But the other thing I want to say about this poem is that even though, Basil is this part of the Akrites, he's one of these border lords, and ostensibly, at least what some people have said about this poem, is that it serves as a sort of imperial propaganda during the Khomeini restoration, where they're retaking the Anatolian lands and they're going east yet again. It's a bit hard to square that with the fact that in this poem, the bad guys, the antagonist, are never really the Arabs. At least for the most part, they're not. Maybe in the very beginning with the story with the emir, but very quickly, even in that case, the emir, a Muslim, he converts to Christianity, and then he gives birth to the protagonist. In fact, the biggest enemies that we see, or the most common one that we see, are the Apalatai, who are these irregular soldiers for the Byzantine Empire. And I guess the other enemy, I guess you could say, in this story is Basil's own passions, which he has to fight against. But either way, in neither of these cases is the enemy Islam or Muslims or the Arabs from those other lands. The enemy is within the borders of Byzantium. So that, in my opinion, makes it kind of hard to square this poem as merely just imperial propaganda. I think more so this poem serves kind of like wisdom literature in a sense. And it says, look, you need to control your passions. You need to control your lusts. And the poem all throughout, I didn't go through all of them, but I went through a few in this podcast so far. But all throughout in this poem, there's these little asides from the narrator saying that desire is one of the most powerful things ever. On one hand, in the case with the emir and Basil's mother, it's able to unite two people in a sense. It's able to bring over someone from Islam to Christianity. However, on the other side, it causes Basil to engage in lustful actions and to be unfaithful against his wife. So then the last part of the poem, I won't really go too much into detail about it, but it essentially documents the end of Basil's life. So it talks about how he sets up this estate on the Euphrates River, which, as I said, is the border between the Christian lands and the Islamic lands. At least it was at that point. And then it talks about the dwelling that he makes. And it's interesting that, in a sense, the poem likens his estate on the Euphrates to be like the Garden of Eden. There's a lot of imagery that it uses. And then what's of particular note about the Euphrates is that if you go back to Genesis and the description of the Garden of Eden, it is said that the Euphrates is one of the rivers that flows out of Eden. And there's a little bit of this paradisical language that's used to describe his estate. But eventually, Basil, he's hanging out with some friends and they go into this bath. And then after they get out of the bath, he contracts some disease, probably either like tetanus or meningitis. And we know that because it's the way that he's described or some of the side effects that he gets. He kind of gets like physically distorted, which is a side effect of either tetanus or meningitis most commonly. And then he eventually dies, and then his wife dies too. And they don't leave behind any children, which again, I think supports my thesis about the fact that Basil is this sort of like monster in a sense, right? Because hybrids, if you read like medieval bestiaries, hybrids can't really have children. And you see this in nature all the time. Various hybrids, they're not able to reproduce. So although Basil has all this, sexual energy about him, as we see in all of his cases of lust, he's not able to, have a child with his wife. And then really that's how the poem ends. But what's interesting in some later retellings of the story, in much more modern poems about Digenes Akritas, is that once he dies, he has this battle in hell against Chiron. Now, in Greek mythology, Chiron is the ferryman who takes you across the river Styx into Hades. He's kind of the one who facilitates your death and takes you into the underworld. And then I'll read you this short poem by Kostas Palamos, who was an early 20th century Greek poet who wrote a little poem about Digenes Akritas here. So I'll read it in full. All right. It says, Chiron brings Digenes to Hades' domain and others with him. The human herd weeps and laments, and he keeps them on his horse, bound by its hood, the wind of valor, the bird of beauty. And as if he had not been tread by Chiron's foot, Akritas, fearless, gazes at the horseman. I am Akritas, Chiron. I do not succumb to the years. You touched me, yet you did not sense me on the marble threshing floors, did you? I am the invincible soul of Salamis' kin. I brought the sword of the Greeks to the 7 hills, which refers to Constantinople. I do not perish in Tartarus, I only withdraw there to rest. I reappear in life and awake nations. Thank you so much for listening. Take care.